Many of you know me from famine studies and history in general in terms of Irish migration to Canada, but many of you may not know that, in fact, in my other life, I actually taught elementary school. I also taught secondary school. I advised the Institute for Catholic Education in Ontario on a number of projects, trained supervisory officers and principals for the Catholic school system, and I actually sat as a Catholic school trustee for a very short period of time. Kind of purgatory on earth. And I use that as kind of a preface to the fact that what I'm bringing to today's discussion is really the experience of an educator, and yet at the same time as a historian in the academy at the University of Toronto. And there's really the engagement of famine study, at least the Irish famine study in Ontario's curriculum, has been very limited. And I think I have 2 points to make, and then I'll pass the torch on to Maureen, because what we have done in the province of Ontario pales in significance to what they have done south of the border. And Maureen, as an American, you should not take this compliment lightly, because you rarely get them from Canadians. So in this particular context, you're several kilometers / miles ahead of us. And I think that's for 2 reasons. The first reason really is Canadian historiography itself. It's really been bipolar for many reasons, not the least of which is that the 2 charter non-Indigenous groups that have been writing the history for the better part of 150 to 200 years have been Anglophone and Francophone, and each of those historiographies has differed with different emphases. So up until the 1960s, Anglophone Canadians tended to focus on 2 things, and that is the Whig history and the development of responsible government in Canada within the context of the British Empire, up until its achievement, at least in central Canada in 1849. And the second was then from colony to nation, how essentially Canada became a nation separate from Great Britain over a series of events, right up through the Statute of Westminster in 1931, right through the Second World War to the present. And some would argue then we became a colony of the United States. So it was colony to nation to colony again. And this became a principal preoccupation in English Canada. In French Canada, the historiography was really stimulated by Lord Durham's report in 1838, 1839, when he said the French Canadians had no past, okay, no present, and no future. And the best thing that could possibly happen to them was to be assimilated into the Anglo-Protestant majority in the colonies. And of course, François-Xavier Garneau became, how should we say, the first professional historian in the French language, and he essentially began a trajectory of a different kind of writing of history, a history of survivance, so the French language of the Catholic fact in Canada, despite those who held attitudes like Lord Durham. And so you have these 2 very different historiographies that, of course, then permeate the school systems in each of the provinces in which these linguistic, cultural, and religious groups inhabit. Now, this changes in the 1960s as Quebec history is influenced by the Quiet Revolution, and it breaks away from a sort of church-focused history of how the language was the guardian of the faith and the faith was the guardian of the language, to, I think, a very Europeanized history, very much influenced by the Annales School, by social history, by quantification, by asking new and exciting questions. And Anglophone historiography became very much influenced by English social history. And so, for the most part, the famine narratives never really fit in to these traditions in Canadian historiography until the late 1960s and early 1970s, when social history and the history of migration became more prominent in the writing of history in both languages in Canada. And I think this is a really important point to discover, because if you were to say, well, why is it that in a book like this, okay, which is the Ontario Catholic School history text, I don't have slides, I'm really old-fashioned, I can do it in 3D, but this was published in 1888. The only mention of the Irish famine was that there had been a typhus epidemic in the Canadas in 1847. Why? Because the professional historians writing this in a company like Sadler's, and the Sadler family had been noted for publishing works on the famine. I see Marguerite nodding her head. They had been prominent, but not a mention in this particular book for Catholic schools. The same would be in this book, which would be the Canadian Catholic Reader, published in 1899. The closest we come to anything that is reminiscent of the famine in these books, which would have been read largely by Catholic students of Irish descent, would be a poem called The Exile of Erin, and that's it. You were more apt to get Shakespeare, Lord Byron, and the English greats than you were to get a sense of Irishness in that book. So the thing is that up until very recently, for Canadian historians, the famine just did not play into, okay, the various historiographical traditions. And there are some exceptions in material history. For example, if you were to see the famine as kind of public education, you would have seen it in monuments of Quebec, and that is linked to the role of the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec in assisting famine orphans. And I select two sites just for your reference and as a shameless plug for touring Quebec at some point when this pandemic is over. The first is a statue of Archbishop, then Cardinal Taschereau in Quebec in front of the Basilica in Quebec City, where one of the panels on his memorial is Taschereau as a young priest dealing with famine Irish migrants at Grosseille. Okay. The second is Archbishop Bourget of Montreal in a monument to him in front of his pro-cathedral, the Notre-Dame du Monde. And there is yet another panel of Bourget himself at the fever sheds at Pointe-Saint-Charles in Montreal, tending to the Irish. So there is material history, there is education of the public in a different way. So that's the first point. Second point I'd like to make is that in Canada, for those who are not familiar with it on this call, Canada's education is provincially governed, which means under the terms of the British North America Act of 1867, which created the Dominion of Canada, education became a provincial responsibility. And so there is no uniformity of curriculum among the 10 provinces or 3 territories of Canada. My province, Ontario, with 14.5 million people, is the largest province in terms of population and has the largest school systems. And here is where we have to parse the question again. There are 4 school systems that are publicly funded and constitutionally protected in Ontario. English non-denominational, French non-denominational, English Catholic, which educates about 600,000 students in the province, and French Catholic. So the curriculum designed is a common curriculum, but then has its specialties parsed out to each one of these 4 distinctive boards. And that all comes under the protection of religious education under the British North America Act, Section 93. So how do we make sense of all of this in terms of curriculum? How would we ever get famine into the curriculum given this level of complexity? Well, the thing is that there's something that the Ontario Ministry of Education calls Circular 14, and it really is the list of prescribed texts for curriculum in schools. So you would have to sort of penetrate that. So for example, this text became part of Circular 14. This one, because it was actually published in Quebec by a Quebec firm, became a supplemental text, recognized as an auxiliary text to the main text that would be offered in the Ontario curriculum. The Ontario curriculum was written by professional educators, still is, and textbooks are produced by historians. So when I was in the 8th grade back in the 60s, I had this book, which was published in 1964 called Canada, a Modern Study. No famine in this one at all. Why? Because the preoccupation was colony to nation, and in this case to colony again. So what do we do given this situation? It means that we have to go through a number of hoops politically and educationally to get the curriculum recognized as such. So there is one series within the Catholic curriculum, and it's called Many Gifts, and its 2nd edition in 2015 in its grade 6 social studies text, because history isn't taught until the secondary school level. It's considered with geography as social studies in Ontario. In grade 6, they do a section on immigration. And what the authors of this book did, both the professional educators and some historians who were consulting, have 2 pages on Irish immigration as an example of immigration. There are 2 examples that are given in the past. One is the Underground Railway of runaway and escaped slaves prior to the American Civil War in 1861 to 1865. And the second is Irish migration, which is almost entirely focused on the famine. I mean, it's problematic because 450,000 Irish migrated to Canada before the famine, but this particular piece at least acknowledges the famine as a singular important event for Irish migration. And that is about it. There is a curriculum document that was written by Leah Evans, and it is entirely a voluntary document that can be used in the grade 7 social studies curriculum, where they begin to look at pre-Confederation Canada. But as such, there is nothing that is officially embedded in the Ontario curriculum, save for this recognized series of Catholic social studies texts, Many Gifts. Why is that? We don't have the kind of advocacy within the Irish community that would be as well organized as what we've heard from Marta and her colleagues on the Ukrainian side. And just as a sidebar, I did my master's thesis on Ukrainian Latin Rite relations within the Catholic Church in Canada. So I know the Ukrainian side a little bit. And the other thing is that we would need the will within the Ontario College of Teachers, within the Ministry of Education, and within the Institute of Catholic Education, which is an umbrella group for at least the 2 Catholic systems, French and English, to actually move in the direction of embedding something in the official curriculum of Ontario schools with regard to the famine. So just a sense of, you know, why didn't this take place earlier? And why is it so complicated to take place now? You could embed it within individual boards. And Valentina has been very successful with the Toronto District School Board, which is the largest school board in all of Canada. But you would need the good nature and the willingness of directors of education in individual boards to initiate that kind of program. To make it system-wide, you have to go through the official channels that I just mentioned. And that, my friends, is in very short a crash course in Canadian historiography and the complications of the Ontario educational system.
Thank you, Mark. That was a fascinating crash course on how to embed famine studies in curriculum or not. Very, very interesting indeed. And now we move on to